On September 23rd, 1973, a bright yellow Porsche 914 pulled onto the track surface at Mosport Park in Ontario on lap 33 of the Canadian Grand Prix. It heralded the arrival of what became the first ever use of a safety car during a Formula One race, and also one of the most confusing moments in F1 history. Hi everyone, it's Elizabeth Blackstock here, US editor over at planetf1.com, and the history nerd in me is very excited to share a little history of the safety car with you here on the F1 Word. And yes, even though F1 first began hosting its World Championship in 1950, the first use of a safety car didn't come until the end of the 1973 season. But before I dig too deep into the introduction of the safety car itself, what on earth did Formula One do to slow the field under dangerous conditions before we had a control car? The answer is not much. In F1's earliest decades, safety was more of a personal choice than it was an official mandate. Technical regulations mostly focused on engine capacity and weight. Races took place at tracks that demonstrated an ability to pay money to competitors and to draw crowds, and crash helmets weren't even mandatory for the sport's first 2 years. Most drivers just turned up at the track with a cloth cap, some goggles, and a short-sleeve shirt, ready to go racing. And even when those crash helmets were debuted, they were made of cork, not out of any other harder material. It's very tough for us to imagine these days when Formula One kind of looks the same from one weekend to the next with the same amount of time between each practice session and the race. But back in the earliest decades, F1 was a lot less structured. For example, F1 had absolutely no control over what a circuit like Spa-Francorchamps did to prepare for a race or how it structured its race weekend. F1 could absolutely request some changes or threaten to abandon the track if it was too dangerous, but once cars arrived on site, Spa's officials were in charge, not F1's. Every F1 track had its own rules and procedures. F1 mostly just abided by them. And F1 took a very similarly liberal approach to driver safety. As a series, it didn't feel much responsibility to guarantee a driver survive a race. It's not like the sport was celebrating death exactly, so much as it accepted death and injury as an inherent part of what motorsport was at the time. Drivers knew the risks, and they were believed to have accepted them if they lined up on the start grid for a Grand Prix. Drivers were also expected to continue racing even when accidents happened during a race. Marshals might stand by the track and wave a yellow flag to let you know that you should probably slow down in a certain area and avoid some crash sites, but no one found it necessary to completely halt a race unless the track itself became impassable. Again, it's all about personal choice. But that was not the case in motorsport around the world. In America, where oval racing was a major component of competition, you really couldn't keep a race going with just a well-placed local yellow flag. A car that runs off the track at the Nürburgring during the German Grand Prix would probably launch out into the trees. It'd probably leave behind some debris, but the car itself would not be blocking the road surface. If a car tried to run off the track at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it was going to hit a wall and bounce back into oncoming traffic. You had to slow down, which means you had to re-rack the field. In America, pace cars were fairly common because oval racing rarely uses standing starts. American race cars needed a push to get going and couldn't launch on their own, so having a car that paced the field and then pulled into the pits was a great way to let everyone know that, hey, the race is starting. The first recorded use of a pace car came at Narragansett Park in Rhode Island, all the way back in 1896 for an electric car race. But the practice itself gained popularity because it was common at the start of the Indianapolis 500. IMS's founder Carl Fisher introduced the pace car for the very first race running back in 1911, and as with most things Indy 500 related, the pace car start became a tradition. In the late 1960s, though, the pace car began to return to the track during caution periods. It provided something of a visual marker for the field to rally behind, and the driver of the pace car could then lead the field back to the green flag in just the same way it had done at the start. It was kind of a haphazard practice, one that was only occasionally used by certain race organizers, but again, it was slowly starting to become popular. Now, I know it's kind of sacrilegious to claim that F1 introduced a technology after being inspired by an American race series, but in the case of the safety car, that's absolutely what happened. We don't have a clearly delineated history here, so we can't say that F1 introduced the safety car as like a direct response to American open wheels pace car, but in the early 1970s, enough F1 drivers had made the trek to America for IndyCar appearances that they were certainly aware of the pace car practice. They probably also saw some value in it. The first ever safety car to be trialed during a race weekend in F1 came at the 1973 Austrian Grand Prix. Now, the 1973 season itself was tragic, and it saw the gnarly death of Roger Williamson at the Dutch Grand Prix. There, the driver crashed right next to the track and proceeded to burn to death, trapped inside the cockpit of his upside-down race car. The Grand Prix continued, with drivers rocketing through the smoke pouring off of the upturned machine. There was no way for ambulances, marshals, or medical personnel to arrive at the scene as the race continued, and the folks that were stationed nearby didn't have the proper equipment required to save a man from an all-consuming fire. It was clear that changes needed to be made in order to address those kinds of cruel incidents. And a pace car was a great step in that direction. So in Austria, a striped Opel Commodore outfitted with flashing lights and loud sirens paced the field in practice, trialing what it could look like if a passenger car held up the pack. But it wasn't used during the race itself. It would take another month for that to happen, and a safety car would make its debut at the 1973 Canadian Grand Prix. The start of the Grand Prix had to be delayed for over an hour because drivers simply could not see the cars in front of them, and when the field finally took the green flag, track conditions were still extremely treacherous. It's something of a miracle that it took until lap 32 of 80 for an incident to take place. It marked a significant turning point in the race itself, too, because by now, the rain had stopped and the track was starting to dry. The full field had started on wet tires, but those tires were going to fall apart under dry conditions, and it was clear the field would need to pit for slick tires. And just so you know, slick tires had only been introduced in F1 2 years earlier. In the early 70s, pit stops were actually really rare during races. But suddenly, all of the good folks at Mosport realized they had every single F1 car on their racetrack about to rocket down a very narrow pit lane that simply was not large enough to handle stops by multiple drivers at once. They needed to neutralize the field in order to ensure everyone could safely stop and for the debris to be cleared so the race could continue. So, a bright yellow Porsche 914 with some credentials hastily taped to the doors and yellow flags flying from brackets on the rear bumper emerged onto the racetrack, intending to take its place in front of the leader. The problem was that so many drivers had already pitted, and so many more still needed to pit, that no one knew who the race leader was. So the Porsche just pulled onto the track in front of the driver it assumed to be the leader, which was Howden Ganley, and he was not. To make matters even worse, the drivers in the field had literally no idea what they were supposed to do during the safety car period, whether they were supposed to line up behind the safety car or overtake it. Remember, this is way before in-car communications and electronic timing and scoring systems, so it was kind of a free-for-all. Eventually, everyone got the memo to line up behind the Porsche, and when the conditions cleared, the race went green again. Emerson Fittipaldi of Team Lotus crossed the finish line in what he thought was first place, prompting some joyous celebrations on the part of team owner Colin Chapman, but officials weren't convinced he actually did win. And 3 hours later, they declared that it was actually Peter Revson of McLaren who won the race. Ask Fittipaldi, though, and he'll probably still tell you he absolutely deserved to win, since plenty of folks believe that the safety car accidentally gave some drivers, including Peter Revson, an extra lap. As you can imagine, the safety car did not exactly impress on its debut, and no one was convinced that it was necessary to the function of a clean F1 race. In fact, it probably just made things all the more confusing. Formula One and the FIA left it up to race organizers to decide what they wanted to do, if they wanted to have a safety car present or not. And the Monaco Grand Prix was one of the few events to actually use a safety car, first in 1976 and then more regularly throughout the 80s. It wasn't until 1992 that other circuits introduced a safety car, and when those trial runs proved to be much less chaotic than the 1973 debut, it prompted the FIA to approve safety cars for all race weekends in 1993, with some well-established procedures in place this time. As a result, safety cars have been an ever-present feature of Formula One ever since. Well, friends, that's all from me today. If you enjoyed this little jaunt through Formula One history, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment to let us know what topic we should tackle next. If you want more from me, Elizabeth Blackstock, head on over to planetf1.com for all of the latest F1 news and analysis, and I'll see you next time for another edition of the F1 Word.